বন্দে তোমায় নিরঞ্জন রূপধার নিরঞ্জন রূপধার নির্গুণ গুণময় মোচন আঘদূষণ জগভূষণ চিদ্ঘন কায় জ্ঞানাঞ্জন বিমল নয়ন জ্ঞানাঞ্জন বিমল নয়ন বিষণে যায় ভাষার ভাবসাগর উন্মাদ প্রেম ভক্তার জন যুগল চরণ ভক্তার জন যুগল চরণ কারণ ভব দৃম্ভেত যোগ ঈশ্বর জগদীশ্বর যোগ সহায় নিরঞ্জন प्रभु मन वचनैकाधार। ज्योतिरज्योति उजल रे दिगंधर, ज्योतिरज्योति उजल रे दिगंधर, तुमी तम भंजनहार प्रभु तुमी तम भंजनहार। नमो नमो प्रभु बाकमनातीत, नमो नमो प्रभु बाकमनातीत मन वचनैकाधार प्रभु मन वचनैकाधार। ज्योतिरज्योति उजल रे दिगंधर, ज्योतिरज्योति उजल दिगंधर, तुमी तम भंजनहार प्रभु तुमी तम भंजनहार। दिदि दिलंग रंग भंग बाजे अंग संग मृदंग, दिदि दिलंग रंग भंग बाजे अंग संग मृदंग। गाइছে ছন্দ ভকত বৃন্দ आरती তোমার, গাইছে ছন্দ ভকত বৃন্দ आरती তোমার। জয় জয় आरती তোমার, হর হর आरती তোমার, শিব শিব आरती তোমার। খণ্ডন ভাব বন্ধন জগ বন্দন বন্দিত মায়। জয় শ্রী গুরু মহারাজ কি জয়। ओं ह्रीं ऋतं तमोचलो गुणाजित गुणेभ्यः नाक्तं तेवां सकरुणां तव पादपद्मं। मोहां कषां बहुकृतां न ভজে যতহং তস্মাত্ত্বমেব শরণং মম দীনবন্ধো ভক্তির্ভগশ্চ ভজনং ভবভেদকারে গচ্ছান্তরং সুবিপুলং গমনায় তাত্মম বক্ত্রধৃতোপি হৃদয়ে ন মে ভাতে কিঞ্চিৎ তস্মাত্ত্বমেব শরণং মম দীনবন্ধো তেজস্তরন্তে তরসাম ত্বয়ি তৃপ্ত তৃষ্ণা রাগে কৃতে ঋতপথে ত্বয়ি রাম কৃষ্ণে মর্তামৃতং তব পদং মরণোর্মিনাশং তস্মাত্ত্বমেব শরণং মম দীনবন্ধো কৃত্যং করোতি কলুষাং কুহকান্তকারে স্নান্তং শিবং সুবিমলং তব নামো নাথ যস্মাদহং ত্বস্মরণ জগদেকগম্য তস্মাত্ত্বমেব শরণং মম দীনবন্ধো ॐ स्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतारवरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः। ॐ नमो श्रीभगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमो श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमो श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ सर्वमङ्गलं मङ्गले शिवे सर्वार्थसाधिके शरण्ये नारायणी नमोस्तुते। सृष्टि स्थिति विनाशानां शक्तिभूते सनातने गुणा नारायणी नमो শরণাগত দীনার্ত পরিত্রাণ পরায়ণে সর্বস্যার্থে হরে দেবী নারায়ণী নমোস্তুতে জয় নারায়ণী নমোস্তুতে জয় নারায়ণী নমোস্তুতে জয় নারায়ণী নমোস্তুতে জয় নারায়ণী নমোস্তুতে। जय महामाय की जय, जय भगवान श्री राम कृष्ण देव की जय, जय स्वामी जी महाराज जी की जय।
Hello, hello.
Hello, check. Namah Shri Atirajaya Vivekananda Sure Satchit Sukhasvarupaya Swamine Tapaharine. So we are resuming this particular lecture of Vivekananda, Maya and Illusion, after a gap of almost a month, about a month. So let me quickly recapitulate where we had let off and where we are going after this. Yeah, so let's get there. So what was the main theme in one word? Essentially, there were various illustrations of the different kinds of contradictions that define our day-to-day existence. These contradictions are at various levels. Emotional, where there is something where he described what we usually, in our common sense terms, describe as love of other people or family members, and then even when it is causing us pain, we still call it love, whereas it's something that is actually, he describes it as something that has caught hold of us. So that is in some sense the contradiction in our emotional lives. Epistemologically, in terms of something that we think that this exists, and then when we probe it, the existence starts vanishing. It's, say for example, our own existence. If we try to understand it in precise terms, what we call our individual existence is nothing more than a convention. This is what it transpires, because the various atoms and molecules that comprise our body change it's in a constant state of flux. We had mentioned that, say for example, in our gut, the human alimentary canal, there's a huge percentage of bacteria, and somehow or the other we seem to call ourselves this I, whereas without those things our day-to-day existence would be difficult, because those are things that digest various parts of our food for us. So even epistemologically, in terms of existence and non-existence, we are, this notion of I with which we behave in the world is not something that we can nail down very precisely. And in terms of experiences that bring us joy, and sorrow, it's the same experience can bring one person joy, another person sorrow, etc., etc. So the sum and substance of what had gone on before this were these various instances which Vivekananda brings forth and portrays very starkly the contradictions at different levels, as I said, emotional, epistemological, existential. At all levels of our existence, there are these contradictions which define our existence. And typically our response is a hope for the future, which takes the form of optimism, or a kind of distress or depression, which takes the form of pessimism. Neither of these is really factual. Neither of these is based on an acceptance of the reality of things, even at this level, even at this behavioral level. So this is where this is what we were discussing, and this is the paragraph. I'm just going to repeat it, which we had just done maybe a little more than a month back. So I'll just read that paragraph one more time before going on. And it says, thus the Vedanta philosophy is neither optimistic nor pessimistic. See, the thing is, optimism or pessimism, these are very subjective human reactions to life situations in terms of what is about to be. Yeah? In fact, in one of, I think most probably it's Bhartrihari, who says, Asha hi paramam dukkham, nairashyam paramam sukham. Yeah. Sounds very paradoxical. Asha, hope. He is paramam dukkham, is the source of all sorrow. Nairashyam, literally hopelessness. Paramam sukham is the source of all joy. That sounds very paradoxical. What does it mean? It means that being attached to our hopes and aspirations is a source of a lot of sorrow when they break. Similarly, Nairashyam here, though it literally means hopelessness, what it should be construed to mean is lack of expectation. Lack of expectation from what? Lack of expectation from the world. The world has not signed a deed with me saying that it is going to treat me according to my personal values. It has not signed a deed and told me that it's going to treat me according to my ideas of fairness, my ideas of good, my ideas of justice. And so, absence of expectation brings with it a certain release, a certain joy, a certain peace. This part is intimately connected with what exactly is called vairagya, dispassion. In other words, what we are trying to do is expand our notion of what values are, what justice is, what fairness is, etc., 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 till we come to a larger, less personal perspective. In other words, we are trying to remove from the way we interact with the world these very narrow personal windows by trying to understand the nature of things in their own terms, which means depersonalizing oneself. So, situations come, situations go, we accept them for what they are. It does not mean that you sit back and you're completely non-functional. It means that you do not get emotionally entangled in the situation. There's a certain detachment and aloofness, and at the same time one could get into action to remedy a situation, to change a situation. It does not need a person to be acting with a huge amount of passion which sort of constantly overflows through one's nerves. That is the aspect which one is taming. Yeah? And hence, this philosophy behind this is supposed to be neither optimistic nor pessimistic. What then? It voices both these views and takes things as they are. You see, this is, again, I mean, this has biological roots. So, our brains, the way they are constructed, every time it sees this world around us, it tries to spin it into a narrative. For example, right now I don't have eyes on the back of my head. But somehow my brain has an image of what this room was when I last saw in that particular direction. It's doing this subliminal computation all the time and telling me in some subliminal way that that view which I had when I looked at the wall behind my head last has not changed since I last saw it. See, the thing is, our view of the world is a construction in our heads. even at the level of our sense perceptions. I have moved my head away from a certain direction. It keeps telling me that what I had seen there is continuing, despite the fact that I have no direct evidence at this point. This allows us to have a certain internal equilibrium. Without this, if I had to constantly look at every side to see if it has changed or not changed, the brain would sort of burn out because it would have to compute so fast. So it has been designed to tell us these stories to make an equilibrium. And then it starts devising further stories, further narratives. This is good, this is bad. The initial part, in terms of biological evolution, the nervous system, particularly our brains, were designed by evolution to keep us alive and lead lives as a successful species. But then, perhaps by chance, it tried to do something new. It saw that there was one part of the system which was very efficient, and that started multiplying. That's why we have such highly developed forebrains as a species. And that's the root of various activities, one of which is creativity, one of which is analysis or discrimination, another is altruism. All these are higher forebrain functions. But these then tell us stories in us, that they sort of manufacture stories in our heads in order to keep the less evolved parts, the parts that are sort of left over from evolution, under control. These are, so for example, we had discussed last time, these instincts of fear and anger, which all of us regard today as something, well, very often as something bad and something to be gotten rid of. But if we try to understand these things in their proper perspective, then we realize that there is nothing good or bad about it. The physical system needs these instincts of fear and anger, both of them for self-preservation. Suppose an ancient human wandering along in a forest suddenly senses some wild animal nearby, a fierce wild animal. It does not have, that creature, that ancient human does not have time to put pen to paper and work out exactly the problem that is there. So he'll just have to run to preserve himself or herself as an individual. This is the good aspect of fear. It's what leads to preservation. Similarly, suppose something is coming to assault and one exerts oneself against that force in order to either feed oneself or preserve again maybe one's family. These are good aspects of anger at that time. So these were useful in terms of our biological evolution. They do have a place. The question is, are we in control? Are we as individuals in control of these, or do these control us? We are not under threat from wild animals today. 10,000 years ago, maybe. Today, if we walk inside a forest, those instincts are not going to save us because we have not really honed them. So, are we in need of these leftover passions? Can we exercise them consciously today? And typically, the answer is no. In other words, we are not in control of them, they are in control of us. which is perfectly natural because that's how nature has designed these passions to save a species. But now our brains have grown, we are societal animals, and we don't really have need for these. But they are there, and so we spin stories of anger and hatred and so on and so forth, maybe against other species, maybe against some imaginary creatures, against ghosts and goblins, etc., etc. This is essentially the leftover of evolution. We don't need it today, just as we don't need the appendix in our alimentary canal today. Similarly, several aspects of these passions are not necessary for us. What then? It's understanding that these are there. There's no point in judging them. The more mature thing is to understand what they are about and channel that exact energy, that mental or emotional energy, into more positive channels. That's what this is about. It's a question of understanding it as objectively, as dispassionately as possible. This is what taking things as they are means. It admits that this world is a mixture of good and evil. Why? Because our minds have constructed these stories of good and evil. And then we get caught by one of these stories and think that, no, this is the way to some absolute good. That's not how it is. That's not how things are. Nobody, and certainly not the world, is going to submit itself to my personal ethical sense of what is good and what is not. It's just not going to function that way. And so, converting something into my personal idea of good and evil is just stupid. The wiser thing to do is to understand what it is about objectively and dispassionately. So it admits that this world is a mixture of good and evil, ethical contradictions, happiness and misery, emotional contradictions, and that to increase the one must of necessity increase the other. In other words, a quest for unmitigated good, not possible. Unmitigated happiness, not possible. This understanding is what this is gunning towards. There will never be a perfectly good or bad world because the very idea is a contradiction in terms. The notion of bad or good does not exist independent of its opposite. Why? Because our minds have created these polar opposites. That's what this is about. It's not something in terms of a philosophical doctrine. It is what one is getting by distilling our experience. Think of ourselves as maybe people in this huge laboratory of the world, and our experiences are our experimental findings. We take that as raw data and analyze and extract knowledge from it. This is what this is about. There is not the great secret revealed by this analysis is that good and bad are not two cut and dried separate existences. There is no firm wall that separates what we call good from what we call bad. In other words, in our subjective awareness, the notions of good and bad overflow into each other into a thoroughly gray domain. That adds color. That adds fabric, texture to our lives. It's the same contradiction but being viewed now in a positive frame of mind. Seeing that, look, this is exactly the nature of things. We don't need to keep on investing ourselves emotionally in our personal ideas of what is good and what is bad. Not just for me. I try to decide what is good for the world. That's the most, it's not just arrogant, it's plain stupid. Because nobody else has really signed a deed and told you that, look, I am going to subscribe to your petty idea of good and your petty idea of bad. It's not going to happen. So there is not one thing in the world of ours which you can label as good and good alone. And there is not one thing in the universe which you can label as bad and bad alone. The very same phenomenon which is appearing to be good now may appear to be bad tomorrow. Exactly what we were describing at the very beginning. These notions of fear and anger, at some point they were good. They were responsible for survival of the species. Today, when we use them and they drive us out of control, the same thing is bad. In other words, to pass this judgment about with this thing is good and that thing is bad, it's in our day-to-day behavior we can do it, but the point is not to be too emotionally invested in it. Not to be too emotionally invested in these judgmentalities. The same thing which is producing misery in one may produce happiness in another. The fire that burns the child may cook a good meal for a starving man. The same nerves that carry the sensations of misery carry also the sensations of happiness. And so what is the way? People often ask, how do we get rid of it? There's no getting rid of it. The only way to stop evil, this is again this ethical contradiction that is surfacing, therefore, is to stop good also. There is no other way. In other words, these ethical contradictions cannot be removed piecemeal. You remove one end of the pole, the other needs to get removed simultaneously. And finally, the existential contradiction. To stop death, we shall have to stop life also. Life without death and happiness without misery are contradictions. And neither can be found alone, because each of them is but a different manifestation of the same thing. In other words, one cannot, this constant, all our medical evolution during the past 100 years has to a great extent extended human life. Now, what is being said here, it's just pushing the inevitable death away. Are we not going to do that? He's going to address this issue later on. But it also means that you cannot cheat death. You cannot avoid it. There is no way to get around it. We keep aspiring for joy and happiness and hope we will not be subject to unhappiness or misery. It's not going to happen. We think we are going to live forever. There's a story that our brain keeps telling us. I have said this before, this thing from the Mahabharata Shanti Parva. Yaksha Prasna. See, what is the strangest thing in the world? Yaksha asks Yudhishthira, his response being, Ahanya hani bhutani gacchanti yama mandiram sheshasthiram icchanti kimascharya adavparam. What is more strange than this? That every day we see around us people dying, animals, creatures, all of them live and they die. And yet our mind keeps telling us this story, we are going to live on forever. So how are we going to address these fundamental contradictions? How are we going to address the fact that any feeling of joy that we experience or sorrow will necessarily tell us that along with this, its polar opposite in terms of our subjective experiences there. Every moment of our life tells us that we are getting one step closer to death. Every moment of joy tells us that there is something which is the absence of this, which is what we call sorrow. What then is the solution? We can do one of two things. Either we can encourage the storytelling aspect of our mind and tell us various stories. And then there are, all our different mythologies and different religions give various cheap, piecemeal solutions to this life and death thing in terms of stories, none of which are verifiable. Yeah, in one kind of primitive religion, there's a notion of a heaven where one goes, and then there are heavens have some various sources of enjoyment. So yeah, my life is miserable today, but after death I shall go and enjoy myself thoroughly. That's one story. Another story is that, okay, fine, in this particular life I haven't finished, so I'm going to recycle myself and come back again and again. Or there is some fierce god who's like a judge in a court, and he is keeping records of all the stuff that I call good and all the stuff that I call bad, and I am going to be judged on Judgment Day and going to be fried in oil for the rest of my life if I have done bad, or I am going to go to a heaven and enjoy myself for the rest of my life. What are these stories about? These are stories that are there, that have been narrated in various forms, in various narratives, in order to address this crucial contradiction between life and death. It accepts this premise that we want a life without death. This lack of boldness to face facts is at the basis of these stories. And different religions have come up with different stories. But these are just stories. They do not face up to the genuine enquiry. Where is the genuine enquiry? Again, it starts off as a story in the Kathopanishad, where Nachiketa asks Yama, some people say that after death one is no more. And others say that no, he lives on forever. And he asks, I want to know the truth of this. In other words, what is the young Nachiketa asking? He is not interested in a story response. He is interested in the truth. And the response, therefore, that finally, that evolves through that particular Upanishad, through the Kathopanishad, is the idea of what aspect of our being is mortal and that which is consciousness itself. It is precisely this impersonal consciousness which perceives which is something that is functioning in and through us. This particular principle, if we could isolate it from these ramifications, then we would have isolated that principle which is not born. These ideas of birth and death are in our minds. What is it that is aware in ourselves of this birth and death? This question needs to be addressed squarely, not in terms of these stories, not in terms of some whitewashing of facts. Say that, no, actually there is only happiness here. Nonsense. No, there is only life that will go on eternally. Even after you're dead, you're going to be alive. I mean, this is the most ridiculous kind of assertion that one can make, right? I mean, it's a contradiction in terms. It's a refusal to accept these as facts of our existence. It's only after one has laid these facts out on the table and understood that their relevance to my own personal day-to-day existence today, after these contradictions have been perceived as real in my day-to-day life here and now, that the question of probing deeper arises. You need the basic facts. Just as in any scientific experiment, just as in any analysis, you need the facts to be laid out before you as if on a table. Without passion, without favoring one narrative against another. These are the facts. Separate them out from all the stories, from all the narratives. And then ask, what is it that I am wanting out of this process? And that enquiry, pursued to the hilt, is going to culminate in whatever understanding, permanent understanding, making real in our day-to-day existence here and now, is what one is after. Okay? And the first step towards that is the acceptance of these contradictions as defining our existence. And I'll just, because this has been a summary of what we did before, let me just say one sentence before I conclude, and maybe I'll read the next paragraph, because this is where the answer to these questions in some sense is given. He says, the Vedanta says there must come a time when we shall look back and laugh at the ideals which make us afraid of giving up our individuality. In other words, actually we are, there's this Israeli author, current author, called Yuval Noah Harari. I think I've mentioned this one book by him here called Sapiens, and there's a subsequent book called Homo Deus, where he dwells on this. We are not individuals, we are actually individuals. In other words, our existence is divided. There are various components. The white blood cell that goes around killing various germs inside our body, it's just a form of an amoeba. That's all it is. It does pretty much the same kind of function. It can survive but these are creatures that we have incorporated. So we really are a mass of individuals, but we think of ourselves as this individual. So even scientifically, this notion of an individuality with which we function in the world is not sustainable as a hypothesis. Each one of us, but what defines our individuality? Basically this, I am this body. That's the basic idea. Each one of us wants to keep this body for an indefinite time. And if we can't, then when we are faced with this fact, that look, this body does die, it's going to die. Yeah, all right, as an intellectual fact, I accept it. Therefore, what do we do? We concoct out of this another notion of some other kind of body. Yeah? But it's basically the same thing as this body idea. Yeah? It's not addressing the problem squarely. It's trying to, okay, fine, this body is going to go, it's a fact, I can't fight with that. Okay, but the body idea will not go. That's my solution to the problem. What is it? It's basically right here, right now, this idea which is at the basis of these contradictions is not something I am willing to address squarely. In other words, I am not interested in the truth, I am interested in these stories. That's really where the problem lies. So each one of us wants to keep this body for an indefinite time, thinking we shall be very happy. And then he gives the answer. But there will come a time when we shall laugh at this idea. Now, if such be the truths, we are in a state of hopeless contradiction. Neither existence nor non-existence, neither misery nor happiness, but a mixture of them. What then is the use of Vedanta and all other philosophies and religions? And then the more important question, and above all, what is the use of doing good work? This is a question that comes to the mind. If it is true that you cannot do good without doing evil, and whenever you try to create happiness, there will always be misery, people will ask you, what is the use of doing good? The answer is, in the first place, that we must work for lessening misery, for that is the only way to make ourselves happy. So this is a lot of stuff, but this is where we'll start next time. The idea is accepting these contradictions as defining our day-to-day existence, understanding that life and death are obverse and reverse of the same coin, happiness and misery are obverse and reverse of the same coin. Same for all our personal values. Yeah? Good, bad, existence, non-existence, life, death, etc., etc. Accepting this in the larger scheme of things is exactly what allows us to detach our mind from one of these pairs of poles of opposites and understand these contradictions in their own terms, and then the contradictions start dissolving very fast. You see, nobody says that the chair contradicts a table. It serves a purpose. To me, they are not contradictory. Now, if the table started fighting with the chair, no, this is the right form for wood to take, and the chair started saying, no, this is the right form for the wood to take, we who can see it from afar would find this ridiculous, right? A pointless fight, a pointless thing where a contradiction is being brought up. Can we bring ourselves to that same kind of detached understanding with regard to the forces acting within us? We'll take that up again next time. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om Tat Sat. Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.